Okay, so yeah, good evening everyone, and welcome back to the 22nd session of the online Optom learning series. And today we have a very eminent speaker with us. We have Professor Brenden Barrett, and he is a specialist in terms of visual characteristics in reduced reading ability. But just let me give some introduction for our speaker today. He graduated with a diploma in optometry from the Dublin Institute of Technology in 1989, and then he went ahead to complete his PhD at a University College of Dublin. He also holds a bachelor's in psychology from the Open University. He was also a lecturer in optometry at the Glasgow University in the mid-1990s before he moved to the University of Bradford, where he has based since then. His current job title is Professor of Visual Development in the School of Optometry and Vision Science. His research interests are in understanding the etiology of neural basis of developmental visual disorders. He's interested in the topic of functional vision. In other words, how vision limits in some individual versus enhances in another individuals. And today he's going to brief us and talk to us about the visual characteristics associated with reduced reading ability. So welcome, Prof. And I think I should give you the screen now.
Very good. Thank you, Grisham, and thank you very much for the invite to present this webinar. I want to start just by saying that this is my take on what optometrists and eye care professionals should do when people present to a clinic with reduced reading ability. And this is naturally from a UK perspective. As you said in your kind welcome for me there, I trained in Dublin. The Irish model of optometry is very similar to the UK model of optometry, and it's very similar really to the US model of optometry also. But I'm really speaking from a UK perspective, and I hope that's useful for the listeners and the viewers to understand what happens in the UK. But I'm very aware that what happens in your countries may be quite different. Just to say, I don't have any conflicts of interest, and I'm really, when I talk about reduced reading ability, I'm talking about reduced reading ability in children. If adults were able to read, and now suddenly something has happened to their vision, and they can't read very well anymore, such as in presbyopia, of course they're symptomatic. They say, you know, my vision isn't, reading isn't as good as it used to be. But I'm talking here really almost exclusively in relation to reading ability in children who are learning to read, and who of course don't have the history of what it looked like before to fall back on. They don't know necessarily whether their vision is normal or not. They don't know if vision is limiting their ability to read. So it's from a child's perspective, and as I say, also from a UK optometry perspective. Let's just move on to this slide. This, I think, is a slide which hopefully will capture some of the things I want to say. Now, if we look here, this is the optometrist concern. Looking for visual dysfunction when a child presents with reading difficulties or learning difficulties of any type. And of course, the optometrist is interested in knowing, is there something about the child's vision or ocular health that could lead to these reading difficulties? It's possible there is. It's also possible that there isn't. Very possible that there isn't, because some of these other aspects may be coming into play. For example, the child may have dyslexia, a problem of reading and writing, which is a cause of the reading difficulties, but obviously outside the scope of what an optometrist is going to attempt to treat. It's also possible, for example, that there are general learning difficulties that the child has. It's possible that there's ADHD or dyspraxia or some other issue with that's a problem for the child in terms of giving the reading enough attention. It's possible that there are emotional difficulties that the child has due to anxiety or low self-esteem. It's possible that the child has hearing difficulties. All of these different aspects could be coming into play, and a very obvious one, but perhaps one that we don't think about as much as we should. It's possible that the child simply isn't very practiced at reading because perhaps there are no books at home, nobody's spending any time with them and trying to help them to read. So when a child is brought to a practice with the parent, usually, of course, and the parent says, I'm bringing my child because they're having difficulties at school, the optometrist is wondering, is it vision? But at the back of the mind, of the optometrist's mind, I think we have to be well aware of the fact that yes, vision may be contributing if there is a reading difficulty, and maybe there isn't, but if there is a reading difficulty, vision may certainly be contributing to that, but it's also possible that it's one of these many other aspects, and that just shows, I think, the complexity of the task faced by the optometrist, trying to distinguish this from perhaps, or try to identify whether something like this is going on in amongst all of the other different possibilities that may exist. So there's the task that the optometrist has. Is there a vision problem? And a related question is there a reading problem? Because the parent may say that the child has a reading problem, and that may be because the child isn't doing very well in school, and the teacher may have spoken to the parent, and the parent then brings the child for an eye examination. In other words, that's second-hand evidence. The optometrist actually doesn't know whether there is a reading problem. It sounds like there is a reading problem if the teacher has said it or if the parent believes it, but that isn't. We don't have first-hand evidence that there is a reading problem in many cases. Of course, first-hand evidence would only come if the optometrist had a test of reading which was age-appropriate, in which they administered to the child and said, yes, the child has a reading difficulty, or no, the child doesn't. So I'm just highlighting here really that in many situations we really have to rely upon second-hand evidence for the fact that a reading difficulty may exist. So really what I'm wanting to do in this talk is to look at, we've got these two spheres. One of them is reading ability, the other is visual skills, and the question is, how do these spheres overlap? This is obviously not the picture here, because we need to be able to have some level of vision in order to be able to read. So the spheres are not they're not separated like this. They must overlap to some extent, but the question is, what part really? What part do visual skills play in reading ability? Is there a little bit of overlap, as some would believe, saying that once you have a rudimentary level of visual ability, that thereafter there's really no contribution or no impact from vision upon reading? Or is it the case that's depicted here in the bottom right of the slide, where visual skills are much more important and much more kind of intimately related to an individual's reading ability? So the outline for the talk is just to talk a little bit about the prevalence of reading difficulties, to say something about the policy statements that have been issued by different organizations, because there's a very big political angle here. There's a very, I hope to be able to persuade you that there's a very significant area of controversy really in relation to all of this, as to whether vision is or isn't a significant contributor to reading difficulties. To talk a little bit about the prevalence of visual difficulties in poor readers, and then I want to draw your attention to two studies, which are two in amongst a whole load of studies that I could have picked, but two studies that I picked just because they arrive at such different conclusions, and I think that's interesting just to take a look at those two, to try to understand why it is that this area may still be so controversial. Towards the end of the talk, I want to just mention a little bit of work that's been conducted by us at the University of Bradford in the UK, and then I will offer my summary and recommendations, as I say, from a UK perspective. But firstly, let's start the whole ball rolling really by asking, what do we mean by saying that somebody is a poor reader? because I want to just sort of emphasize the point that it's not trivially easy to say that somebody is a poor reader because of the different aspects to that. The task or the test of reading that we sometimes use in the UK, and there are many tests, and the tests in your part of the world will be different. But the test that we commonly use is something called the York test, the York Assessment for Reading Comprehension. And in that test, the child reads 2 passages of text. The text difficulty is governed by what age the child is and what school year they're in. And then we're looking at 3 different measures of reading. So there's an accuracy measure. How are the words read properly? Has the child been able to identify all of the words? Then there's a rate measure, how quickly the child takes to read the text. And once the child has read the passage of text, they're asked questions about the text, and of course that's comprehension. To what extent do they understand what they read? So the York test, like many other tests, provides different sort of indices of reading ability: accuracy, rate, and comprehension. So if you say to somebody, well, are you a poor reader or are you a good reader? If somebody reads very, very quickly but doesn't understand what they've read, are they a poor reader? They're a poor reader, because the purpose of reading is to extract meaning from the text. If somebody, on the other hand, understands completely what they've read but takes a long time to read it, they too might be classed as a poor reader, even though they have understood what it is that they've read very well. So it's a difficult problem, is the point I'm trying to make. And just to give you an example here, back to here. This is the text that's being read, and these are the notes that are added to the text that are being by the test administrator. So the child read, it was Poppy's first day at school. She was feeling a bit, and the administrator of the test has indicated here that there's OM, that's to indicate that there's an omission. In other words, the child didn't read this word here. And then the child said she was feeling a bit, and the administrator of the test has indicated that this is REF, short for a refusal. So you can see how the test is scored. There are mispronunciations, there are substitutions, refusals, additions, words that weren't there that were read. Substitutions are a different word in place of the one that's there. Omissions, where words aren't read. And then the number of errors is counted, and the number of seconds taken to read the passage of text is recorded. And this gives a measure of the accuracy, this gives a measure of the rate, and as I said, questions are asked of the child about what it is that they've read, and from that we can get a score on the comprehension. And here are some data that we gathered at the University of Bradford. I'm going to be saying more about this project. It was a project that was co-supervised by me and funded by the College of Optometrists here in the UK. But our PhD student, who's now graduated, Caroline Chambers, gathered these data. And what you see here are rate and accuracy scores plotted against one another. So on the x-axis here, we have the rate of reading, and we have the accuracy of reading. So each one of these dots here corresponds to a child. SS here stands for standard score, and that's to indicate that the test scores appear on a scale where 100 is the average, and anything less than 100 is below average. And this would be a very poor rate of reading. This is a very fast rate of reading. This is a very low. This is a very low accuracy, and this is a very high accuracy. And when you plot rate scores against accuracy scores, you get a very high correlation. So if we look at the proportion of variance that's explained by these data, it's 71%. So in other words, if you know somebody's rate of reading, you'll probably have a very good idea of what their accuracy is, or vice versa. Let's now take a look and see what happens if you plot accuracy or rate against comprehension. And that's what's shown in the next slide. So this time, instead of rate on the x-axis. We have comprehension. Again, 100 is average comprehension, above average comprehension over here, below average comprehension over here. And again, each dot corresponds to one child. Now, when you look at what proportion of variance is explained by these data, by this linear fit to these data, it's only 21%. What we're saying is, if you know somebody's comprehension, you'll probably not make a very good prediction, or you may not make a very good prediction of what their accuracy is. Or if you know somebody's accuracy, you're unlikely to make a very good prediction about what their comprehension is. And that's kind of what I've done here in the next slide here, is just to pick a couple of examples. So if we take a look here at this child here that I've circled in red, they've got an average comprehension score because it's close to 100, but the rate of reading is below what it's expected to be. It's about 85 on the standard scale. But here's another child whose comprehension is about 100, and their accuracy is much greater. So that's I've just sort of highlighted here with these two red circles just how the same comprehension can be associated with two hugely different levels of accuracy. And similarly, I've picked out two children here, ringed in blue. Both have an accuracy of about 100, so they're doing their average in relation to the accuracy of what they read. But look at this child here, really reduced comprehension, well above average comprehension. So when we say what a child is a poor reader, for example, the first thing to say is that there are rate measurements, there's accuracy measurements, and there are comprehension measurements, and they can give us a different picture. So if we just relied upon accuracy here, we would be missing the fact that this child here has a much poorer comprehension as compared to this child. If we rely on comprehension alone, well, what we'll miss is the fact that there's hugely different rates of accuracy of reading. This graph here tries to plot all three measures on the one plot. And what's different about this graph, well, first of all, let me say what's similar. It's similar to a graph we saw a moment ago. On the x-axis, we have accuracy. On the y-axis, we have rate. But what we've done here is plotted comprehension according to color code. So anything that's towards the blue end of the scale is a high comprehension level. Anything that's towards the red, orange end of the scale is a low comprehension. So if we look at these symbols here, this is the same data as we saw previously, accuracy versus rate, but now it has the added measure of comprehension present. And what you see is that children who are up in this area of the graph here, who have a high accuracy and a high comprehension, have a high rate and a high accuracy, also tend to have blue color-coded symbols. In other words, they have a high comprehension level. But that doesn't always happen. Take a look at this blue symbol down here. This child has a good level of comprehension, right here, this blue symbol. This child has a good level of comprehension, but has well below average rate and below average accuracy. So again, just illustrating the point that different measures, accuracy, rate, comprehension, they don't always pull in the same direction. We don't always get high rate and high accuracy in children who are good comprehenders and vice versa. Similarly, look at this child here who's doing very well on accuracy, a score of about 120, and well above average also on rate, but has a poor comprehension. So there are, I've highlighted these particular points because they're clear outliers. So what precisely do we mean by poor reading? Well, do we mean slow reading, inaccurate reading, or poor comprehension? Maybe we mean all three. What if there's adequate comprehension but slow and or inaccurate reading? Well, that arises fairly commonly, and it's something that we have to think about very carefully when we're asking what we mean by whether somebody is or isn't a poor reader. Reading is a skill, and like any skill, performance across the population varies greatly, and it improves with practice. But one of the things that we might think about as optometrists is that if reading is slow or inaccurate, it's more likely to be due to vision problems. In other words, if somebody has a pretty good comprehension, but hasn't been able to read quickly or has made some errors, it's possible that vision is the cause. It's also, there are other causes also, but if somebody can extract meaning from text, not having read it effortlessly and perhaps taking a little bit too much time to read it, it's possible that vision is playing a part in that slow and inaccurate reading. Good comprehension can exist alongside slow and inaccurate reading. I've said that. Comprehension scores are less linked to vision. So that's one of the reasons why when optometrists administer tests of reading, tests of comprehension are less likely to be administered. It's more likely to be tests for reading rate and reading accuracy, because those two measures are more likely to be linked to whether or not there's a vision problem. And I would ask you to ask yourselves in practice, what tests do you as an eye care professional have to measure reading performance? How would you establish whether or not a child has a reading problem or doesn't have a reading problem if they attend your practice because, for example, a teacher has said that they're not reading well? It's a big problem. Reading and learning difficulties are a very, very big problem. I'm going to refer to this publication from 2011 quite a lot in this talk. Approximately 20% of the population has some degree of learning disability. In the US, 5.5% of public school students are identified as having learning disabilities. Depending on the definition, the prevalence of reading disability is 5 to 20% of school-aged children. So obviously it depends on how you define a reading disability, but even if you make the criterion very strict, 5% is an awful lot. If you loosen the definition, it can rise as high as 20%. And that same publication, the American Academy of Pediatrics publication from 2011, has suggested that 5 to 10% of US children are eventually classified as low achievers. In the UK, 4 to 8% of school children have dyslexia, and we know that there, as I showed in one of the earlier slides, there are many other reasons why children may not read very well, such as not having access to books at home or hearing difficulties, whatever. But just from dyslexia alone, 4 to 8%. So large, very large proportions of school-age children are having reading learning difficulties. Reading and learning difficulties generally show up in the early years, and they don't disappear without intervention. That's why it's so important that if there is a reading difficulty suspected, that it's found early. Here's what the American Academy of Pediatrics says. Over time, good readers and poor readers without intervention, so in other words, it hasn't been identified, nothing's been done about it. So over time, good readers and poor readers without intervention tend to maintain the relative positions along the spectrum of readability. Of reading ability. So in other words, the poor readers don't catch up. Children who get off to a poor start in reading rarely catch up on their own. A poor reader in first grade will almost invariably stay. So this first grade is at the very beginning of school life. A poor reader in first grade will almost invariably stay a poor reader. More than 88% of these children display similar difficulties at the end of the fourth grade. So it's important to find these children who are struggling with poor reading, whether it's vision or whether it's something else. It's very important to find them, because they're going to struggle. Then they're probably not going to catch up by themselves. This whole area is very, very controversial. The whole area of a link between learning disabilities, dyslexia, and vision is a politicized and controversial area, and I just want to sort of draw your attention to that. perhaps you're well aware of this, and I apologize if you are, but this same publication, the American Academy of Pediatrics, 2009 publication that was updated in 2011, and let's just see what they're saying about the link between vision and learning disabilities or reading disabilities. So here's what they say in the 2011 statement. Vision problems can interfere with the process of reading. So nobody's disputing that vision is important for reading. It is, obviously. But what they're saying is that children with dyslexia or related learning disabilities have the same visual function and ocular health as those without such conditions. So in other words, vision is not contributing to the visual difficulties that these children are having. Currently, there's inadequate scientific evidence to support the view that subtle eye or visual problems cause or increase the severity of learning difficulties. And here's the really interesting one from an optometrist perspective. I apologize for all of the text that I'm asking you to read, but scientific evidence does not support the claims that visual training, muscle exercises, ocular pursuit and tracking exercises, behavioral or perceptual vision therapy, training glasses, prisms, colored lenses, or filters are effective direct or indirect treatments for learning disabilities. So they're saying really, I think you can see pretty clearly there that they don't believe that vision is a major contributor to learning disabilities that people have, because the vision of those individuals is about the same as the vision of individuals who read normally or don't have learning disabilities, and because there's no scientific evidence to support the use of all of these different approaches that optometrists might want to roll out. In the UK, the Royal College of Optometrists aren't quite so they're not quite so direct about it, but they say the cause of reading problems revolves around the language difficulty of phonemic awareness. In other words, sight-sound correspondence. When a child tries to read a word, that they try and make the sound that is suggested by the grapheme, and it's a problem of sight, making the correspondence between the grapheme and the phoneme. That's at the heart of the reading difficulties in individuals. And they go on to say that a thorough ocular examination may be requested and should exclude the presence of reduced vision, asthenopic symptoms that might arise from poor fusional range, or poor accommodation, or convergence issues, or other ocular pathologies. So they're saying that a thorough eye examination is important, but they're saying that the cause of the problem is associated with phonemic awareness, and all eye care specialists, ophthalmologists, and optometrists should be doing is ruling out the presence of these possible causal agents. The 2011 statement, you might say, well, that's a little bit dated. It hasn't been updated as far as I'm aware, but here are a couple of quotations from a 2017 paper, which is titled Reading Difficulties in the Pediatric Ophthalmologist. Myths continue to exist regarding dyslexia and vision, and although eye and vision problems may coexist with dyslexia, they are not more prevalent than in the general population. So the quotations that I'm going to show you from this paper here are very much along the same lines as the 2011 American Academy of Pediatrics paper, basically just saying that there's no evidence to link vision to dyslexia or reading difficulties. Rarely, vision problems may make reading at near very difficult and may masquerade as a learning problem or ADHD. So it does exist in their view, but it's hardly it hardly ever exists. Treatments to improve these eye conditions may help reading more comfortable, but they're not a therapy for coexisting dyslexia. The use of vision therapy has never been shown to be scientifically effective, and may prevent the application of effective interventions. So they're basically saying that if you spend time trying to follow vision therapy, that you're taking time away, you're basically not attending to the real problem when reading disorders can be best corrected. and they conclude that the pediatric ophthalmologist should provide prompt referral to professionals who have expertise in evaluating and treating learning disabilities. So the summary so far is as follows. Defining what a poor reader is problematic. Whatever the criterion we use to define it, reading difficulty, it's a big problem. In other words, it affects a large proportion of our population, and it shows up in the early school years. The issue of whether subtle visual anomalies cause reading problems is highly topical, and it's highly political. Now, I'm not for a moment suggesting that if there's a significant refractive error, or if there's a significant binocular vision problem, or if there's ocular pathology, that those things don't affect reading ability. I think everybody's in agreement that these things, these conditions need to be found early. They need to be treated where that's possible and appropriate. What we're really saying here is, I think the most important word here is subtle visual anomalies. Whether or not subtle visual anomalies, things that require almost extensive testing, whether they could be the cause of poor reading. And there's a large view, a large and prevailing view amongst many political bodies and representative bodies for ophthalmologists in the United States, for ophthalmologists in the UK. Also, within the UK as well, there would be a similar feeling that subtle visual anomalies are not the cause of reading difficulties amongst children in school. Let's have a little look at what the literature says. There are hundreds, thousands of papers on reading and vision, but in actual fact, very, very few meta-analysis studies. And I just want to draw your attention to one of them, which is old, but I think it's an interesting one, partly because of the myopia control story. Some of the findings from this meta-analysis paper. It's from the American Journal in 1988. It's a meta-analysis of 34 different studies that looks at vision anomalies and reading skills. So there are loads and loads of studies on vision and reading, but not many on vision from what we might call an optometric perspective. But this is definitely one of those. It's 34 studies. And what they did was they just looked what conditions that an optometrist might uncover that are linked with below average reading or above average reading or are not associated with reading. And here are the ones that they found to be associated with below average reading. Some of them you might say, well, there's no great surprise. Hyperopia is associated with below average reading, exophoria at near, vertical phoria, and anisometropia and anisoconia. So you might say, well, all of these are binocular vision problems, and hyperopia, no great surprise there, but they're associated with below average reading. And in actual fact, the Vision in Preschoolers series of studies is certainly backing that up, that moderate to significant hyperopia is associated with poor reading ability amongst school children. These are the factors that they were, strangely, were associated with above average reading. So if you were myopic, does that tell us something about the origins of myopia? That myopia is associated with above average reading ability, but it was myopia in combination with esophoria. And distance esophoria is also associated with above average reading ability. So there's something interesting there, I think, really in relation to the myopia control studies, and esophoria has also been linked to myopia, particularly esophoria near to later development of myopia. So there may be something going on there, but I don't know exactly what that link is. Here are all the different factors that they found were not associated with reading performance. Reduced visual acuity, astigmatism, esophoria at near, fusional convergence and divergence, the presence of strabismus, what the near point of convergence was, or what the level of stereopsis was. None of those factors, whether, for example, visual acuity was good, not very good, significantly reduced, that did not come across as a factor which it was linked to to reading performance. Just want to draw your attention to two fairly recent papers which have drawn two opposite conclusions about the relationship between vision and reading, and in doing so I hope to just sort of highlight some of the controversy in this area. The first of these is a study from an American group authored by Grisham, and what they did in this study, which is a pretty big sample, 461 students who were had an average age of about 15 years of age, and what they did was they identified these individuals as poor readers in high school, and they ran a whole battery of vision tests on these children, and they used published norms to classify the various test measures that they'd gathered as normal or subnormal. So they didn't gather their own normative data, they just referred to the literature to say, is the measure of, for example, near point of convergence normal or abnormal, based upon the published literature. And what they found, or what they present in their paper, is on the y-axis here a proportion of students, and on the x-axis all of the different tests that they carried out. And so what they're showing here, for example, is this first test here is the base-in break. So this is the fusion range with base-in prisms until there's a break in fusion, and they find that just below 80% of the poor readers had an inadequate base-in break. So they looked at the published norms for the base-in fusion reserves at near, and they in each child they made a decision: is this normal or below normal? And they find that 80%, or just approaching 80% of children who are poor readers have a fusional reserve at near which is not adequate. And then the next test, these are in descending order, as you can see. Base-in recovery was the next test that was around about 50%. Base out fusional reserves at near to the break point. Accommodative facility in about 25%. Accommodative amplitude was reduced in about 25% of the poor readers, all the way to near point of convergence, which was inadequate in more than 10%. And so on the basis of that, they concluded that 80% of students were found to be inadequate or weak in one or more visual skills. And the interpretation is really clear from that, even though they don't they present these optometric data, but the implication of what they're saying is very, very clear, I think, that visual deficits may be playing a causal role. Why else would you have, for example, 80% of children with poor base-in fusion reserves in poor readers, unless those fusion reserves were somehow playing a part in the poor reading? So they don't actually make the link, but that's certainly the implication of what they're suggesting. So the first of these two studies I'm showing you here, 80% of students were found to be inadequate on one or more vision tests. Here's the other study that I want to draw to your attention: Ophthalmic Abnormalities and Reading Impairment. And this study is from 2015. It was published in Pediatrics. And what they did in this study was they compared the vision optometric measures in around about 5,000, just under 5,900 children, and I should say of whom 3% had severe reading impairment. And what they did then was they said, okay, these are the children who have severe reading impairment. Let's take a look at their optometric measures and let's compare them to the optometric measures of the many more children who had normal or approaching normal reading performance. And what they found was that almost exactly the opposite of what Grisham had found. They found that 80% of children with severe reading impairment had normal visual function on each and every test that they ran on them. and they concluded that they found no evidence that vision-based treatments would be useful to help children with severe reading impairments. So I wanted just to draw that to your attention, because to me it's striking, the similarity in the numbers, but the sort of opposite conclusions. Grisham is saying 80% of poor readers display poor or weak performance in one or more vision skills, and Creven, that's the last paper I had on the screen, 80% of children with severe reading impairment have completely normal ophthalmic function. They couldn't find any, even one vision measure which was abnormal. So this area is controversial, and there's much work going on, and some of the work that's been going on in this area has been done by us in Bradford. Caroline Wilson was our PhD student. She's just graduated, and Jim Gilchrist was co-supervisor, the main supervisor on this project, which was supervised by the College of Optometrists. And Caroline gathered a large volume of data. The goal of her PhD work was to explore the factors associated with reading ability in primary school children. So children, once they start school and for the first few years of their school life. So she gathered a whole load of measures, most of which I'm not going to talk about today, but she gathered measures of reading accuracy, rate, and comprehension with the OCT test that I talked about at the beginning. She gathered measures of phonological awareness. I'm not going to talk about those today. And also attention and working memory. Again, I'm not going to say anything about those today. I am going to say something about visual perceptual skills, which she gathered data on with the DTVP, the Developmental Test of Visual Perception, edition number 2. And she also gathered a whole battery. Caroline is an optometrist, and she gathered a whole battery of visual acuity measures, accommodation, divergence measures that I'll say something about in a few minutes. She gathered data on 125 primary school children who were between 8 and 9 years of age, a few more girls than boys. Most of the children were unselected. In other words, she went to the schools and gathered these data. Some of them had come to the University of Bradford Eye Clinic because their parents wanted them to have an eye examination, but none of them had a dyslexia diagnosis. And based upon their performance on the York reading test, we divided the sample into 3. So the red coded symbols are those with poor reading performance, below average reading performance. This is average reading performance, and the green is above average. So we're using this kind of traffic light system. Again, you'll recall that I talked about standard score. Well, average reading performance, on the York test, for accuracy about 104, so just above 100. For rate, just above 100. For comprehension, a fraction below. But numbers for accuracy, rate, and comprehension for this average group, as you'd expect, hovering around the 100 mark for the standard score that this test uses. And then the high group are showing numbers well above 100, 118 for accuracy, 119, 110 just about, and these numbers here below 100 for the low ability reading group. Again, the size of in this case here, the size of the symbol reflects the comprehension. So we have accuracy on the y-axis, rate on the x-axis as we had before, but this time the size of the symbol corresponds to the comprehension. So if you take a look at this again, each little dot here represents a child's performance. That little red dot there corresponds to a child who had pretty good accuracy, average accuracy, above 100, and slightly reduced rate of reading. But look how small the symbol is, and that the size of the symbol here corresponds to the comprehension. In the previous figure, we had comprehension coded according to whether it was blue on one end of the scale or orange, but we can't do that now because we're using colors for the traffic light system. So this time comprehension is reflected in the size of the symbols. So the bigger the symbol, like this one here, is the better the comprehension. The smaller the symbol, like the one that we just looked at, that one there, the worse the comprehension. She also gathered measures of developmental of visual perception, as I mentioned, and I just want to sort of very briefly say something about this, not because I think we've corroborated earlier findings. We haven't found something that's very different, but there is something very interesting about the link between visual perception and reading. First of all, just to say, what is visual perception? Here's one of many definitions that you could find, but a pretty good definition, I think. The ability to use vision to adapt to the environment, which requires the integration of vision with the central nervous system to turn the raw data supplied by the retina into cognitive concepts of the perception of space and objects that can be manipulated for and used for decision making. And that process is known as visual perception. So it's doing something with the information that's imaged on the retina for decision making. And I don't know how familiar you are with tests of visual perception. We'll have a look at one or more in a moment. In the UK, tests of visual perception are not really gathered or not really administered by optometrists. They're more usually administered by educational psychologists or occupational therapists. And here's an example of a test of visual perception. So, some instructions below. The task of the child really is to take a look at this figure here, which has closure, in other words, it's complete, and then to say, these are some drawings by somebody who was halfway or most of the way towards drawing this. So the child is asked to look at all of these and say, is number 1 an incomplete version of this one, or is it number 2 that's an incomplete? So it's a multiple choice. The child has got to say, is it 1, 2, 3, or 4? And you can see here that in this case, number 1 is the incomplete version of this one. So this is the visually closed version of this incomplete one here. And you can see, for example, that point there would indicate close inspection here, would indicate that number 2 is not the correct answer because there's no such appearance in this area here. So it requires the child to take a look at this one here, and then sequentially to look from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to say and to pick out which of these is the one that's an incomplete version of that. And that's called visual closure. And I'm mentioning that for a reason. There are different types, several different types of visual perception measures, but it turns out that visual closure is actually strongly linked to reading ability. Let's take a look at this slide here. This slide is showing accuracy and rate here again as previously, and it's also showing this time again the blue symbols are comprehension like we saw previously. So it's showing accuracy, rate, and comprehension, but it's also showing either large symbols or small symbols. Small symbols indicate that visual perception is good. So if we just take a look here, for example, at that dot there, which again represents a child, high accuracy, high rate of reading, and because it's a blue symbol, good comprehension, and because the symbol is small, that indicates that visual perception is good. So the small symbol here corresponds to average or above average visual perception. But the larger symbols here correspond to children who have poor visual perception when their scores are tallied on the visual perception scores. And it turns out that if you look at this end of the scale here, where there's high accuracy, high rate of reading, and predominantly very blue symbols, in other words, high comprehension, all of the children have normal visual perception. All of the symbols are small in size. But as you go down the scale of reading ability and move towards the center, now some children here who have pretty good accuracy, pretty good rate of reading, but poor comprehension and a poor visual perception score. And as we go lower still on the scale to poorer levels of accuracy, of rate, Again, we see little blue in the symbols here, no blue at all, in fact, so poor comprehension also, and large symbols indicating that the visual perception is also poor. So we take from this the fact that children who have very good reading ability tend to have good visual perception, but children with average reading skills can have poor visual perception, and there's a greater tendency when we get to the end here, poor children, children with poor reading ability very commonly have poor visual perceptual skills. This isn't new. Our findings aren't new. Marianne Frostig in the 1960s developed tests of visual perception. The present day tests are derivatives basically of her groundbreaking work. And there have been meta-analysis studies of the relationship between visual perceptual skills and reading achievement. And really all I want to say, the only additional point I want to make here is that what we seem to know very well is that visual perception is an important correlate of reading achievement. In other words, if this is poor, there's a good likelihood that reading achievement will be poor. If this is good, there's a good likelihood that reading achievement will be good and perhaps very good. And this meta-analysis study concluded by saying that visual perceptual skills should be included in the complex of factors that are predictive of reading achievement. But at the moment, we don't really understand why it is that visual perceptual measures link as well as they do to reading achievement. All we know is that they do link. We don't have a direction of causality. We don't know whether it's association or causality, or in what way one could link to the other in a causal fashion. So visual perception is linked to reading. What about the more familiar measures of reading that optometrists gather? Well, the other work that Caroline did was she gathered visual acuity data, logMAR charts, stereo acuity, accommodation, vergence, and in each case, we looked at the published norms to indicate what we would consider to be a pass. So, for example, monocular visual acuity, 0.2 or better on a logMAR chart with if the logMAR score was above 0.2, that was a fail. If there was a difference in acuity of 0.15 logMAR units or greater, that was a fail. Binocularly, if 0.2 logMAR or greater, it was a fail. Stereo acuity, if it was 120 seconds, it was greater than 120 seconds of arc, it was a fail. So these are our failed criteria. And what Caroline did really was she counted up the number of tests of vision that had been failed by different children, and that's what's shown here, just from monocular visual acuity, binocular visual acuity, and stereo acuity. These three groups again are the below average, the average, and the above average groups, again color coded, red, amber, and green. And what you're seeing here really is the fact that, well, I think in agreement with many other studies that have gone before, there isn't really a clear link between monocular visual acuity and reading performance. If there was, what you'd have would be a very long red bar, a less lengthy amber bar, and a very, very small or non-existent green bar. But you can see here the proportion of the number of children, about 7, it looks like from the scale, about 7 children who were high ability readers had failed the monocular visual acuity criterion, and 8 children in the low ability. So there's no clear link there between monocular visual acuity and reading performance. Similarly with binocular performance, similarly with stereo acuity, just as many children with poor or with stereo acuity above 120 seconds of arc were in the low ability group, and 5 children were also in the high reading ability group. So there's no indication that any of these measures link to reading ability, just as Creven had found in that study I referred to earlier in the pediatrics paper from 2015. these are the measures from the other tests. So these are the plots from the other tests. So accommodation lag, accommodation amplitude, negative relative accommodation, positive relative accommodation, all of the different tests that we carried out. And there is some indication that some may show the pattern that we might expect if they were contributing to poor performance. Take a look here at the bottom here at Virgin's facility. So more children with a fail on Virgin's facility are in the low ability group as compared to children who are in the high ability group. It's double. You could say twice as many children with Virgin's facility fail in the Virgin's facility test are in the low ability group compared to the number of children in the high ability group. But again, the pattern is not very, very clear. And overall, Caroline's results allowed us to conclude really that there's not a strong link between the optometric measures that we gather in our eye examinations and visual and reading ability. You'll be familiar with this. I think this is the last graph I'm showing you. Again, accuracy on the x-axis, rate on the y-axis. Comprehension again is color-coded as to whether the symbols are blue with very good reading ability, good comprehension ability, or orange stroke red with very poor comprehension ability. And this time the size of the symbols corresponds to how many of those optometric tests were failed. So if the symbol is large, as big as this symbol here, for example, 9 tests from the eye examination were failed relative to the published criteria. If the symbol is very small, 0 tests were failed. And when you look at what's going on here, you might expect, I think I did expect when we were producing this graph, I did expect that we wouldn't see very many children here with large symbols. In other words, children who have a high performance on accuracy and a high rate of reading and a good comprehension because the symbols are very blue in color, that the number of tests that they would have failed, for example, accommodation lag in Virgin's facility and so on and so forth, the number of tests that they would have failed would have been very, very low. But what you see here really is a sizable number of tests. Look at some of these symbols here, 6 tests or 8 tests corresponding to this size of symbol, a sizable number of children across the reading spectrum failing a significant number of tests. This child here, the symbol looks to be maybe 6 tests failed here, despite good accuracy, good rate of reading, and a good comprehension. So there's no obvious link between the number of vision criteria failed and reading ability, and so this is just coming to the end of the talk now. This was the task that the optometrist had. Is there a visual dysfunction present which could be leading to the reading difficulty which the parent says is there or the teacher says is there? And if there isn't a visual dysfunction there, what else might it be? Where else do we need to go to try and get to the bottom of what's actually happening? Our results that I presented from Caroline's PhD thesis indicate that there's a high prevalence of poor or very poor visual perceptual skills in primary school age children of both low and average reading ability. Children with high reading ability don't seem to show those visual perceptual deficits. But also our results show a high prevalence of vision and oculomotor anomalies in primary school children across all levels of reading ability. That's the graph that we just looked at a moment ago, where we had even children with very, very high reading ability, no matter how you code that in accuracy, rate, or comprehension, showing poorer than expected performance on vision tests that we administer in our eye examination. So here are my summary and recommendations. I've got 2 slides for this. Defining what a poor reader is or what poor reading is very problematic, but reading difficulties, no matter how you define them, are extremely common. They show up early in school-age children and they seem to persist unless intervention takes place. So they're really very important for the appropriate professionals to identify and to uncover early. There is a huge number of studies on vision and reading, but it's not unusual to see studies almost coming from the same perspective, drawing opposite conclusions. And that's what I sort of attempted to highlight to you with those two papers that I picked out. I could have picked out many more. Vision perception scores are linked to reading ability, but strangely, and I don't know whether this will surprise you or not, but standard optometric measures of vision and oculomotor ability do not seem to link to reading ability. That's not to say that vision oculomotor deficits don't exist. In fact, it's the case that vision oculomotor difficulties are common in children of all reading abilities, and that's a reason for us to be on the lookout for them. Even if a child is doing extremely well in school and is just brought for a routine eye examination, it's very possible that that child still exhibits a vision or an oculomotor deficit. This area is controversial. Some would say it's highly controversial. Again, we're talking about subtle visual anomalies here. There's widespread agreement that significant refractive error, ocular pathology, and major binocular anomalies, they need to be diagnosed and they need to be treated. There's no controversy about that. This is all about the subtle visual anomalies that optometrists can uncover. So eye care practitioners, optometrists need to carry out appropriate testing in an agreed and systematic fashion, always referring to published norms when we're trying to decide whether something is normal, of course. A standardized approach to measuring reading ability should be used to test reading ability if we can, because this comes back to the point I mentioned earlier as to whether we have first-hand evidence. When a child is brought through the door of the practice into the clinic, and there are reports that there's poor reading, I think it's important that optometrists actually know, is that actually the case? It may not be the case. It would be good for us always to have a validated, standardized measure to actually give to the test, to give to the child, to make up our own mind as to whether we think that there is a there's a reading problem there or not. I think one thing that's very important to remember is that eye care practitioners, optometrists, are part of a multidisciplinary team. Certainly, that's the message that I think is coming across strongly in the UK at the moment. So we've got to liaise with other professionals. If reading is poor but vision appears to be normal and the eyes are healthy, or if we only find a subtle anomaly of vision, let's say, for example, we find a poor near point of convergence, and maybe one other vision test is showing a poor performance, I think it would be important to exercise caution in communicating with the parents about the effect that any intervention or treatment may have on reading or learning. We may need to refer to an appropriate professional, because what we're basically saying is there's no vision problem, the eyes are healthy, or there's only something very, very subtle. And the evidence is strongly suggesting that these subtle anomalies perhaps don't cause reading difficulties. So we might still want to treat those conditions and bring them to the attention of the parent and give exercises or perhaps refractive correction, but the evidence seems to suggest that those things alone will not make a difference in the long term to whether somebody is able to develop their reading skills. And just as a final point, in the UK here, I think we try to encourage optometrists to communicate with the teachers to let the teacher know what has actually happened when an eye examination has been conducted, as to whether the findings were normal or not normal. Because if the teacher is aware that the child has been for an eye examination, and for example that vision is normal, there are no problems there, then between the teacher and the parent, hopefully the child will end up being getting the help that they need, or being seen by the appropriate professional to try and develop their skills and hopefully remediate the learning disability. And right there, I'd like to stop and to say thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Prof. It was really enlightening. I think you have given us a very deep and a very brief idea about the topic of concern. We do have a couple of questions here, and I would request the attendees, if there are any questions, to put up on the chat, and I would read it out for you, Prof.
Sure.
Somebody is asking on which type of visual perceptual skill tests can we give to the children at clinic?
Well, I'm not sure that optometrists will want to get into the area of issuing visual perception tests. I mentioned that in the talk really because I just wanted to draw to your attention that visual perception is linked to reading. If we want to find out whether a child's reading ability is reduced or isn't reduced, I think the best thing to do is to give them a test of reading ability, and hopefully a standardized, validated test of reading ability. In the UK, at least, optometrists would hardly ever issue or administer tests of visual perception, because oftentimes there isn't time to conduct that, and as I say, but more important than the time issue is that if we want to figure out whether reading is reduced or not, the best thing is to actually directly measure the reading ability. Tests of visual perception, yes, they could be administered. There are validated tests, and I mentioned the DTVP test, but mostly those tests are not administered by optometrists. They're administered by educational psychologists or occupational therapists or other people. And in fact, in the UK, and this may apply in your country also, that in the UK, to buy the DTVP test, you have to have certain qualifications. They won't just sell that test to anybody, and I don't think an optometrist in the UK could actually buy it unless they had specialist qualifications.
Okay, thank you, Prof. There's one more question that besides doing the binocular vision assessment, they are using the DEM test and the Read EZ test software to relate or assess the patient's visual skills. So they wanted to know your opinion on these two tests, the DEM and the Read EZ test.
I'm not so familiar with the second test. I'm familiar with the I may have misheard but I'm familiar with the developmental eye movement test, and that has, I think that has, again, it's not a test that would be used in routine practice here in the UK, but it's it has its uses, and I think in specialist clinics here it would certainly be used. It does seem to link to the ability to move the eyes around in a fashion that might be analogous. I'm not sure that it is analogous to what happens during reading, but I think that the DEM test measures have some value. That's true. And whoever's asked that question, it's a good question, because one thing that we in the research that I described from the University of Bradford, one thing we didn't do was any eye tracking. We didn't track the ability of the movement of the eyes when the children who participated in our studies were reading. And the DEM test, of course, is a surrogate for eye tracking. So I think it has its uses.
Yeah. And what's your take on using chromatic filters or lenses in management of children with learning difficulties?
Yeah, that's a very controversial area. Again, it's very different in different parts of the world. Here in the UK, it's quite a big part of the approach to treatment. I think this is a very, very controversial area, and there's very little evidence to support. I conducted a systematic review with a number of colleagues a few years ago, and we found no evidence that changing the color, tinting lenses improves the reading ability. Now, that's not to say that changing the color of the lens doesn't help individuals feel subjectively more comfortable. That's certainly the case, that people do report that their vision is more comfortable, that they can look at text more easily and get less symptoms. But when we conducted our systematic review, we weren't able to find evidence that reading was actually improved simply by changing the color. So there's very little scientific evidence linking chromatic filters to better reading performance. But a number of people, well, a lot of people in the UK do wear colored filters precisely for that purpose. And all I would say is, well, nobody can ever know precisely what somebody is experiencing, the difference between looking through colored filters versus not looking through colored filters. But whoever is issuing those colored filters, the advice and the guidance in the UK is that they should certainly rule out anything else first of all. In other words, make sure that there's no binocular vision anomaly or something else going on in the background, and identify and treat that condition, and not to do so before issuing colored filters is unethical.
Okay. And in the same lines, what about the vision therapy perspective? I mean, are there any guidance on vision therapy or any recommended vision therapy which you would like to do for patients with learning difficulties?
Well, I mean, I think what the research indicates, my take on the research that's been conducted is that as optometrists, we should look very carefully. You could take the view, based upon what I've said, that there's no strong link. In fact, there's not even a moderate link between visual anomalies and reading. You could take the view from that it's not important then to search for these visual anomalies, and that's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying that optometrists should take the approach of during an eye examination of being very careful to look for the kinds of signs that we think could be giving rise to difficulties. My point at the end of the talk really was just to say that because there isn't a strong link between visual anomalies and reading, we should be very careful in saying to a parent, for example, I'm going to issue this vision therapy and this will make a big difference to your child, and he or she will be able to read much better as a result of me carrying out this vision, or your child carrying out this vision therapy. I think that's too strong to say. We simply don't have the evidence to be able to say that. So I think the approaches to vision therapy that are out there, that you were taught during your optometric training, which I've seen have been talked about in this webinar series, they're all very important to carry out and conduct. But as I say, I wouldn't link them necessarily. I don't think I would call them a cure for learning difficulties. I think they're a cure for a vision problem, which we have identified, and that if we've carried out our investigation carefully, as I say, with standardized tests and reference to norms, then we can be certain that there is a vision problem there, which we can decide that if it's in the best interest of the patient to treat that, then we should go ahead and treat that. But I think it's dangerous, I think, to make the next link to say this will be the cure for the reading difficulty, because we simply don't have the evidence to back that up. And I hope that came across in the talk.
Yeah. And is there any way to improve the visual perception skills?
Now that's a very interesting one. I don't know of longitudinal studies that have looked into that, but that's a very interesting one. And when I said that the direction of causation, knowing that visual perceptual skills are linked to reading ability doesn't tell us if visual perceptual skills are a cause of the reduced reading ability. It would be very interesting, I think, to look to see if you trained visual perceptual skills, would that lead to a separate independent, if you like, improvement in reading performance. I don't know. Maybe it would. I don't. If that evidence exists, I don't know about it. Similarly, you could say, well, if you improved reading performance and therapy was given for reading performance, maybe that in itself would lead to better visual perceptual skills. But I think that's a really interesting question. And as I say, what we know exists is a link at the moment. We don't know, is poor visual perceptual skills causing poor reading? Is poor reading causing poor visual perceptual skills? Or maybe something else is causing both of them, both those things. But that's a very interesting area, and one that I don't know the answer to.
Okay, just one last question, Prof. People are, nowadays using vision training and vision therapy, but there are researchers saying that it doesn't work. But there are still vision therapists working on kids with various learning disabilities with the help of improving the binocular vision skills. So
Yeah.
What's your view on this?
I think I don't see anything wrong with that at all. And as I say, I think optometrists, the message that I really want people to take from the talk is that it's very important for optometrists to identify visual problems where they exist and where they think it's within their scope of ability to try and address these issues with vision therapy. There is a lack of evidence in the literature for vision therapy. There is a problem there because it's very difficult to conduct these studies, and funding typically hasn't been available for them. But that's not to say that they don't work. So I know of many practices here in the UK, I'm sure all around the world, where people specialize in vision therapy. They uncover a problem, they use their best attempts to try and address that problem or issue exercises for home, and they reassess the patient, not necessarily a child, of course, reassess the patient, and things improve. And really all I'm saying here today is that we don't know for certain that that's going to improve reading ability or performance in school. That I think is a step too far to say. But you asked what my view is on vision therapy per se. My view on that is the evidence base is weak for it, but that is not to say that it doesn't work. And provided it's carried out appropriately and ethically, I think it's an important part of optometric practice.
And any idea about the dynamic reader? And there are certain softwares which help to improve the reading abilities. So would that work? Yes,
I mean there are so many different approaches to improving reading. Vast numbers of approaches to improving reading performance. Some of them are visually based. Some of them are not vision based. It's very hard to know what is the best approach. That's the difficulty. My view is that the role of an optometrist is crucially important. It's to identify whether or not there's a problem there, and to go ahead and try to treat it or manage it if one is found. But I think once we establish what we can establish, we should be thinking about referral to other people, to more appropriately qualified professionals who can help in this. But one thing that's very striking from the literature, I think, is that poor reading is often improved by reading. It's often improved by practice with reading. So the many studies that have been conducted where the child is doing poorly in school, but they're brought, a special needs person or another adult comes along and brings 2 or 3 of those children who are not doing well and sits with them and spends some time with them, developing their skills in reading, that works as well. So the range of therapies, if you like, for poor reading or learning difficulties ranges all the way from very sophisticated pieces of equipment and eye tracking and all kinds of stuff like that, all the way to very simply just spending more time with the child in smaller groups and helping them, because it is a skill that needs to be learned. And so I don't. You've asked me about a specific therapy for reading. There are many. There are dozens of different therapies, and I wouldn't say that any of them. I wouldn't say that any of them are not useful. But perhaps what's most useful of all is, if a vision problem has been ruled out, just to spend more time, or the therapies that seem to suggest that more time spent reading can be every bit as effective as some of the very elaborate pieces of equipment that are on sale. But again, the kind of the overriding point I'd like to make here is that as I see it, certainly that's outside the scope, certainly of UK optometry, to be straying into areas that are more better, that are better really catered for by educational psychologists and occupational therapists.
Yeah. Okay, Prof. I think thank you very much. We have taken up all the questions. Thank you for your inputs and taking out the time again from the team OOLS, and we really appreciate your time, Prof. And we would wish to have you in the future again with different topics and different ideas.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Okay, welcome, Prof. So I'll just share my screen to let the viewers and the attendees know for the session we have in the future. So we have moved to weekly session, and we have the next session on the following Saturday. We have Optom Shamasha, and she is going to talk to us about the early intervention, which is the key to the pediatric success in the first 1,000 days. So she is going to share with us about this particular topic. Please tune in next Saturday, 2 p.m. afternoon Indian time and 4:30 afternoon, or you can say early evening Malaysian time. So until then, stay home, stay safe, and see you all again next week. Bye.